We acknowledge and we celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and we pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. Colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Security College here at the Crawford School, here at the Australian National University. And a particular welcome to our colleagues and collaborators in this evening's event from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre in the Coral Bell School, also at ANU. I'm also especially pleased to welcome some of our distinguished guests, notably the ambassadors of the Philippines and Norway, and senior diplomatic representatives from the missions of Vietnam, the United States, Indonesia, France and Singapore. I think that's an indication of the global importance of the security issues that we're here to discuss tonight. Now, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rory Medcalf. I'm the head of the National Security College. It was my privilege to be recently appointed as the second head of the college after Michael L'Estrange, our founding head. The discussion that we will shortly have is about the security challenges in the South China Sea, and this is in part a reflection of the evolving mission of this college. It's not only a training institution for the Australian national security community, and many of you are familiar with that training and some of our alumni are here tonight, but it's also a platform, in my view, for a better standard of policy debate and policy understanding right across the spectrum of security issues here in Australia. And we can't avoid the reality that the South China Sea is ultimately an Australian national security issue, as well as a challenge for so many other countries. Now, this is for multiple reasons. Australia's security ultimately depends on a rules-based regional order, and any damage to that order through coercion or risk-taking or unilateral assertiveness by any country, as we've seen in these contested waters in recent years, equates with damage to our interests. Secondly, Australia's vital lifelines and trade routes to and from our top 3 trading partners, from China, Japan and South Korea, run through those waters. Third, the tensions in the South China Sea are testing American resolve, American credibility and diplomatic dexterity. And America is Australia's ally, and therefore these are tests for us too. Fourth, as the region comes to terms with how to incorporate a powerful China and its legitimate interests, the way that China behaves when its interests brush up against those of smaller powers provides a test case for us all to watch very, very closely. And fifth, if tensions in these waters were to escalate into conflict, Australia would not be able to pretend that it's not our business. It will affect our interests no matter what. So this evening's discussion is enormously timely. Now, just last week, not far from here, the South China Sea made global headlines when the commander of the US Pacific Fleet, Admiral Harry Harris, warned of the perils around China's so-called Great Wall of Sand. That is, of course, the rapid program of island building, including potential military infrastructure that is changing facts in the water and building a new status quo in the waters that China contests with the Philippines and Vietnam. Now, it's a pity, in my view, that the negotiation of a code of conduct to manage the tensions and the disputes seems to be proceeding with rather less haste than the work of those very efficient Chinese bulldozer drivers and dredge operators. Now, the Admiral's speech could perhaps have been more delicately worded, but in my view, his point was a reasonable one and not an intrinsically dangerous or escalatory one, as some observers have been quoted as describing it. A similar point has previously been alluded to by Assistant Secretary of State Danny Russell and is now being repeated, perhaps more diplomatically, by Defence Secretary Ash Carter on his timely visit to the region. The island building is a new kind of provocation to which no country yet has a credible response. So tonight's event, as I've said, is timely. And my predecessor at the college and his team had, I think, very good prescience and judgment in commissioning the research project on which tonight's event is based. It's, after all, in a sense, a book launch for an excellent collection of chapters, and I should, at this point, show the book, an excellent collection of chapters by some leading experts in the field, looking at political, legal and regional security perspectives on the South China Sea dispute. I recommend the book, of course, published by Routledge, but also its predecessor occasional paper, published by the National Security College, which I believe you can obtain for a rather reduced price than an important academic tome. Now, shortly we're going to hear brief presentations from the editors of the book, Dr. Leszek Buszynski and Professor Chris Roberts, and I congratulate the editors on this achievement, as well as from one of the contributors, Associate Professor Brendan Taylor, the head of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. Their areas of focus will include the perspectives of Vietnam and the Philippines, countries whose views must be counted as strongly held, just as those of China are. I should also give apologies at this point for those of you who've come here under false pretences, because my colleague Professor Michael Wesley, head of the Coral Bell School, and another of the book's contributing authors is unable to join us this evening, but we'll have opportunities to engage with him on these issues at a later date. I should note also that the book contains some particularly useful and insightful chapters, or a chapter on legal aspects of the dispute from Professor Don Rothwell, head of the school at the ANU College of Law, and I again look forward to our opportunities in the future to conduct a future event with Professor Rothwell to look more squarely at the legal aspects of the disputes, particularly the Philippine case for arbitration and China's own interpretations of the law of the sea. So to conclude my opening remarks and to open up a wider set of presentations and discussion, I want us all to think about 5 questions. First, what are the security risks arising from continued tension in the South China Sea? Second, what are the contours of a possible resolution to these disputes? Thirdly, is resolution a realistic option? Fourth, do dispute management and confidence building measures comprise a more feasible set of options for preventing conflict? And how would these work? More feasible, that is, than resolution. Is resolution, in fact, a pipe dream? And finally, what are the options before the international community if the present situation, including the island building, continues? So 5 questions for us to ponder as we listen to the presentations from my colleagues. After their presentations, and that is presentations from Leszek Buszynski, from Chris Roberts and from Brendan Taylor, I look forward to moderating a discussion on these and other questions, and we'd really like your contributions to that discussion. So just a reminder, the event is on the record. Please switch off your phones if you haven't already. What you ask and what you say is on the record, and that's I think, very valuable for transparency in this discussion. I do, of course, encourage tweeting, so if any of you are looking at your phones during the discussion, I know you'll be doing it for the right reasons. I will now invite our first speaker, Dr. Leszek Buszynski, to take the stage.
Well, I'm very pleased to see so many turn up at this book launch. I've sketched out a few ideas that I want to present to you today in the very limited time I have available. First is why this project was launched and what we were concerned about when we approached the previous director and asked him for support, which he very kindly gave. Why the South China Sea? Let me then make a few broad remarks, because we see it as multidimensional. It has 2 essential dimensions. The first is that it is a matter of legality. There's a legal issue involved for the ASEAN claimants, Vietnam, the Philippines in particular, less so Malaysia and Indonesia. Indonesia doesn't consider itself a claimant, less so Brunei, because they seek to have their claims supported and confirmed by international law and UNCLOS. The other part of the story is China, whose legal claim is of very dubious value and bases its claim upon the so-called 9-dash line, which doesn't meet legal criteria, and historical rights. And we have a tension between these views. One is, or approaches, one invokes contemporary international law and UNCLOS, which China has agreed to support, and the other is based largely, but not entirely, upon so-called historical rights, a very dubious 9-dash line. And so we have a China that is raising or resorting to what I call the power of insistence in order to have its claim accepted by others. And why go to such lengths? What is China doing? I've looked at this issue for many decades, since it blew up for ASEAN in 1988, when there was a clash between Vietnam and China, and ASEAN became worried about this issue. We see consistency in China's approach, and we wonder why. Why go to the lengths of reclaiming these reefs, building possible airfields upon them, and so forth? Because this is an area of potential strategic rivalry between China, the US, and China, Japan. I would hesitate, and certainly will not use the word crisis. There are some observers of the South China Sea who talk in terms of an imminent crisis, potential war, and so forth. All that I regard as rather fanciful. And what I mean by strategic rivalry, the word strategic is a very hackneyed term. It's often bandied about without explanation. And what I mean is that there is a contest for positional rivalry over rivals or potential rivals using the South China Sea. And there are two such areas in East Asia. One is the Korean Peninsula, and the second is the South China Sea. Taiwan drops out of the area, but I see linkages here. As regards the South China Sea, dominance over the area would give China control of the trade routes and would possibly deny what the United States seeks to protect in that area, which is freedom of navigation. Dominance over the area would also allow China's Navy egress into the Taiwan Straits to meet or to counter an American effort to protect Taiwan in the event of conflict with the mainland, and would also allow the Chinese Navy access to the Malacca Straits and to protect China's oil lifeline. Now, if you look at China's maritime geography, you look at it from the point of view of the Navy, there are a few points where China's Navy can have access to the external sea, the wider ocean. Not from the north, because that is where Japan is building up its Navy, a dangerous place. Not in the center, because you have Taiwan there, which is linked to the US, only the south remains. You look at it from the naval perspective. And given what the Chinese have said about the importance of protecting their oil lifeline, the SLOCs, the South China Sea becomes an important area in order to preserve access to the open sea for these purposes. There's a connection with Japan again. It involves Japan, not just the US. We cannot cast this issue entirely in terms of Sino-US rivalry, because dominance over this area would give China a way of squeezing Japan. When you link the Sengaku Dayu dispute and the rivalry between Japan and China with the South China Sea, you can understand how Japan looks at the issue and why Japan is indeed concerned. Now, in the book, we looked at China's claim, because the Chinese claim indisputable sovereignty and that the area is ancient Chinese territory. Both claims are of very recent origin, hardly ancient, because dynastic China had little contact with this area. And an analysis, cartographical analysis of maps, Chinese, British, Spanish, French maps, some of which are in the National Library here, they show that the area was outside dynastic China's area of interest. It was a maritime frontier. And with the border, in the Ming dynasty at least, following the coastline. So what we have is a China which is relying upon the power of insistence, as I put it, and the orchestration of maritime surveillance agencies to obtain acceptance of a dominant position in the area, and to have that position accepted by ASEAN without fighting, simply by incremental steps intended to wear down resistance from rivals or opponents, Vietnam and the Philippines, and to have them eventually accept what and to have them present the inevitable. This is very much in keeping with what has been written about Chinese strategy and the way China operates to avoid war, but to press on in order to secure one's position without the risk of conflict. In the book, Zhang Zhang, who wrote on China, wrote that China is positioning itself for negotiations over the issue and may, in time, negotiate when the circumstances, or if they are favorable. He doesn't go into when they will be favorable, but it's a question we can ask. We had Renata de Castro in the book, our Philippine colleague, who argues that the loss of Scarborough Shoal to China in 2012 was a classic low-key, non-violent way of squeezing out, pushing out the claimants. China obtained this shoal with minimal cost. We had Do Tan Hai, who's seated in front of us, another contributor, who wrote on Vietnam and the Vietnamese claim and how Vietnam indeed struggles with this issue. We had the legal perspective from Don Rothwell, who examined some recent developments in international law and how they affect the issue. And we had the American perspective from Ralph Emmers, who looked at the American pivot, the Obama administration's pivot into the area, which was, to a large extent, stimulated by events that we have discussed, and perhaps we'll be discussing today, in the South China Sea. The future. We have a chapter which covers the future. And the Philippines, let me mention that the Philippines appealed to an arbitral tribunal under Annex 7 of UNCLOS to clarify China's claim and to its rights, the rights allocated to it to resources within its exclusive economic zone. Now, that was indeed surprising for the Chinese. I was in the Philippines, Manila, recently, asking Filipino lawyers about this, about their appeal. And it seems that the Chinese were very much surprised that the Philippines would do this. They wanted the Filipinos to be quiet, like the Vietnamese or the others, not to raise the issue publicly and not to embarrass the Chinese. But the Filipinos are a nation of lawyers. Everything is public for them. They will go to law. Now, it seems to me, and it seems to some of the legal experts I've spoken to about this appeal, that the tribunal is unlikely to wash its hands of the issue. It may be tempted to, there may be a temptation on the part of some to do this, say, look, China is a big power, this is a complicated issue, we don't get involved, China has claimed that the tribunal has no jurisdiction, therefore no decision will be made. But the tribunal is, at least the judges, justices in the tribunal, are all very familiar with UNCLOS, have lived with UNCLOS all their lives, all their professional lives. And if they avoid this issue and the legal issues raised, UNCLOS will have little value. So it seems to me, and seems to others who've looked at this issue, that the tribunal will have to examine and and will have to avoid the temptation to skirt around the issue, will have to examine Philippine rights to the exclusive economic zone. And those rights have been guaranteed, assured by UNCLOS. And that is where the trouble is with China. It may avoid the issue of the 9-dash line, which is also part of the Philippine appeal, because China has not presented documents supporting that issue. But it cannot avoid the issue of Philippine rights in the exclusive economic zone. China may accept the ruling and work towards a legal settlement and bring its position in line with law. That is the best case scenario that China in the future may do that. Because it will ultimately benefit from law as a major trading power, and as its economic interests and investments abroad become vulnerable to disruption, it will be in China's interests to reach to law protection. However, perhaps it's too logical for politics in China. China may not forge an internal consensus which is extremely difficult in that kind of political situation, may not be forthcoming over this issue. And it may ignore the ruling. It may slide into legally unsustainable positions as it becomes more assertive in trade, intellectual property protection, as well as maritime disputes. That's the worst case scenario. If that happens, then I think China's actions and China's assertiveness will stimulate the formation of coalitions, security relationships involving the aggrieved ASEAN claimants, not just the United States, but Japan as well. And on the outside, India. It will bring together various combinations involving external powers, regional claimants, and part claimants, as I would put Indonesia in that area. In that worst case scenario, regional security would be the worst for it. And at that point, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Good evening. First of all, I'd just like to start by thanking Rory for his very kind remarks and introduction, and also to thank the National Security College for the research grant that was provided that led to both the occasional paper, conference, and eventually this book on the South China Sea, as well as the field work that Leszek and I participated in that also contributed to some of the content in what I hope are some of the key chapters within the book. Today I'm just going to, I guess, give a bit of an overview of some of the key developments without going into too much detail, and then some focus on the regional implications, a little bit about the perceptions that we have come across in the region about these developments, and some brief remarks about the implications. Just in terms of the importance of the South China Sea, for those of you that are less familiar, depending on what figures you look at, up to 50% of global trade travels through the sea lanes of communication. Up to 50% of hydrocarbons also travel through this. So there are key issues, not just about the centre of the South China Sea being open to shipping, etc., but also some of the straits, such as Malacca Straits, Lombok Straits, and Sunda Straits. It actually represents 25% of South China Sea's protein needs. That's through fishing. That's 10% of the world's protein requirements. So it's quite a key resource in terms of food. Hydrocarbons, well, I'll leave you to look at the book, but there are a very diverse array of estimates, and some of the highest estimates, perhaps unsurprisingly, come from Chinese institutes, which may also play into skewed perceptions about the importance of the region on certain fronts. We've also seen a little bit of increased analysis about the importance of the area as a marine environment, reefs, shoals, etc., and the recent sort of land reclamation that was mentioned earlier being undermining some of that. You can see here a rough picture of, for example, the unilaterally imposed fishing ban each year by China. And just a list of some of the other recent developments, which I won't go into detail with each of them individually. But last year, we did see some disconcerting events concerning the oil rig, deep sea oil rig 981 by China. And we saw fairly large, or relatively very large protests within Vietnam, leading to the deaths of some Chinese citizens. And this is a little bit of a taste, I think, of the level of nationalism that is under the surface and is often an underestimated component of a number of the claimants. And I would put the three top in terms of the risk of nationalism affecting policy being in China, Vietnam, and also the Philippines. From the Chinese perspective, going into Beijing, I guess 2 years ago now, and also in looking at public statements and scholarly analysis, etc. There is the argument within Beijing that they themselves are responding to provocations, statements or submissions under UNCLOS, etc., dating back to 2008 or 2009. The US Secretary of State at the comments at one of the ASEAN Regional Forum meetings as being an example of internationalization, which is something that China really wants to resist. And I guess at another level, which is not infrequent, the statement that China has indisputable sovereignty. If it's indisputable, there is no dispute, so therefore it can do anything it likes because it is actually its own backyard. So this becomes a somewhat circular argument in discussions, say, for example, that Leszek and I held in the South China Sea. So we used to hear the word creeping assertiveness. Perhaps we can say a kind of attempt, perhaps misguided if we look at things in terms of international law, a more strict interpretation of international law, and what judges, etc., in, say, the Permanent Court of Arbitration would actually see through as a strategy. But we do see the attempt to exercise effective control over these and other shoals and reefs. And you can see the quote from one senior military officer of general rank, who stated, "There will come a time when no one will remember that we not only rightly held sovereignty over the Paracel Islands, but also did control them until their occupation at the end of the Vietnam War." Of course, there are different interpretations, but from the League of Nations to UN Charter, we have the concept that there is no right of conquest, and so there's a whole debate associated with things like Woody Island, etc., as to what is the right position there in terms of ownership and how that issue can be resolved. But as in line with this creeping sovereignty, you can see here an image of the various ships, which also included PLA Navy ships in this image. And up until a few years ago, the large sort of consensus was that the Chinese Navy was staying out and not part of a coordinated effort. But we've seen that change significantly in the last couple of years. And here are some recent images from early this year of the extent of land reclamation taking place. This is a picture or image of Mischief Reef area. Of course, other countries have also been, claimant states have been involved in reclamation over the years. It's not just China. Perhaps the one exception would be Brunei, as far as the 5 or so claimant states are concerned. This is dredging as at 2012 of Johnson Reef, and here we can see fiery cross reef in the Spratly chain of islands and the establishment of a possible runway, which again I would argue has more of a strategic implication rather than a legal implication. It has the implication of being able to extend power, resupply efforts, project power across the South China Sea, with some analysis arguing that there is at least perhaps a contingency in the future, a contingency or a plan to establish something like an ADIZ, an air defence identification zone, similar to what we saw a few years back in Northeast Asia. Woody Island, part of the Paracel Island chain, is one of the sites of the most work and has gone on for the longest time, well before the recent sort of news coverage of areas concerning the Spratly Island, but again, significant developments taking place there. Also, we have imagery of, increased imagery of PLA Navy ships and their presence in various locations in the South China Sea, and some analysis to suggest that one of the outcomes of some of the early reclamation in the last couple of years, land reclamation, has been the ability to have one ship such as this permanently in the region on rotation, but with the increased facilities that China now holds, being able to maintain a resupply of that vessel. But really, you know, in terms of just how much of a challenge in terms of security, etc., I think it's useful to put in context, for example, trends in military expenditure. If we look in the East Asian context from the CIPRI military database, China has quite an impressive, if I can use that word, rate of increase in its expenditure. But if we take things at a global level, we still see North America, US and Canada, well above the total expenditure of China, although China coming close to the total expenditure as of 2012 with the European Union. But the story doesn't end there, because if we think in terms of, if I can sort of twist a term from economics, when they say GDP and purchasing power parity terms, I guess I'll tweak that and use the term purchasing power parity differentials. So we're not comparing, you know, oranges with oranges. What China can achieve with its budget in terms of funding personnel, in terms of manufacturing military equipment, in terms of designing new technology, is a completely different, pardon the reference, kettle of fish to say what the US can do with 4 times or whatever the money. So I think there needs to be some further considered discussion. Of course, transparency an issue there, but just in terms of some of the achievements that China is making. For example, last year 50 naval ships are said to have been commissioned. Possible second aircraft carrier by 2018. We have armed Coast Guard ships being produced on an unprecedented scale, up to 10,000 tonnage in size, and statements such as by Admiral Locklear. Now, just in my last couple of slides here, I guess it's important to think about China's aim and what it could be seeking to achieve. Leszek has talked in part about that. I think if we look at the stationing of Chinese assets, what's taking place, the whole picture, it does at least point to some disconcerting contingencies that agencies within Beijing, if not the party itself, are at least keeping in mind for use under certain circumstances, and I'll come to that in a moment. However, this is not without costs, and recent behaviour are not without costs. We see Vietnam, for example, entering into a contract and has received already part of its order for 6 fast attack Kilo-class submarines from Russia, and other countries increasing their expenditure, not to a point of an arms race, but nonetheless seeking to increase the level of deterrence against future action from China, and perhaps to deter such actions in the future. Perhaps countries are seeking a little bit more strategic diversity, reassessing their partnerships. We saw in the last couple of weeks an enhanced comprehensive partnership between Australia and Vietnam entered into, which had more than a dozen references to UNCLOS, South China Sea, regional security, etc. So we can see what is very much on the minds of countries as they seek to forge stronger relations, and I would find it hard to imagine that recent events do not tie in, and certainly the specific reference to South China Sea indicates that. One general mentioned to me in Vietnam that as far as relations or a shift in relations to be warmer with or closer with India is concerned, Vietnam started, if anything, 10 years too late, but they're seeking to make up for lost time now. We see a statement by Japan's Prime Minister standing next to the Filipino President saying we stand shoulder to shoulder. The interests, effectively stating the interests of the two countries, the Philippines and Japan, are the same, and this links to earlier comments tonight as well. We see the Philippines also raising or citing its treaty with the United States, a somewhat awkward initial response, perhaps, or at least perhaps more accurately a hesitant response, but a strengthening of the US position in favour of the treaty over the last couple of years, which I think is a natural response to other developments that I've highlighted, including those orchestrated by Beijing. Vietnam, for example, is looking at joint exploration with Indian and Russian state-owned enterprises, which also raises the risk of, say, a cable-cutting incident by Chinese vessels as being closer to being an incident with the state itself. Policies of economic diversification, a 200% increase, it's still limited in the scheme of things, but a 200% increase in trade in recent years between Vietnam and India. Meanwhile, on the other side, we may have some countries that are bandwagoning. In 2010, the Chinese ambassador to Brunei stated that the two countries were negotiating a sort of a MOU on joint exploration. There's nothing stated for the next couple of years until it was announced in the last year or two. And so this also links to what we have seen as a fragmentation of what was some earlier unity and collective statements and declarations in the 1990s, and the pursuit of a code of conduct that led to a compromise position on the 2002 Declaration on Conduct of the Parties in the South China Sea. We've also saw the inability of ASEAN for the first time in its 45 or 50-year history to come to the conclusion of a joint communique because of the insistence by the Philippines and Vietnam on certain references to recent developments at a foreign ministers meeting, ASEAN foreign ministers meeting in Phnom Penh in 2012. Indonesia played a key role in sort of reconciling that issue, but a situation of carrots and sticks, trade agreements, arrangements, investments and aid to some of the smaller countries. And if you have a country like Laos, where the GDP is perhaps $6 billion or thereabouts, it doesn't take much of China's budget to have a significant impact and thereby influence through its aid and investment. We also see a very different alignments at the strategic level, treaty partners of the US in the case of the Philippines, to other countries that are much more closely aligned with a US. Now, I agree with Leszek that Indonesia is not officially a claimant state, but we have in recent years actually seen a hardening of Indonesia's position as well in response. And this is a cost of China's actions, where, for example, various senior defence officials have stated that Indonesia's territorial interests do conflict with the 9-dash line, with China's maritime claims. I have been out to other agencies, such as out in Bogor, and in discussions and presentations with those, or one particular agency, security agency out there, the discussion was not what role can Indonesia play, how does it actually defend its interests. The one agency that steadfastly states it is not a disputant seems to be the Foreign Ministry, or Kemlu, at this point in time. It's perhaps a useful diplomatic device, because if you look at the Natuna gas field, the continental shelf, the EEZ, etc., it does actually conflict with the 9-dash line. But by being a neutral, honest broker as such, perhaps Indonesia has been able to play more of a role than it might otherwise have had. And so there's an important debate to be had there as to what path and direction Indonesia should take in the future. Second last slide here, just in terms of the factors mitigating the risk of conflict. Of course, I've mentioned the damage to China's reputation, the strategic repercussions. Of course, China is not independent of the global economy. It also relies on many factors associated with this, including investor confidence, etc. Both my predecessors tonight have referred to international law and UNCLOS. If a country is exceptionless with regard to its legal obligations as a signatory state to UNCLOS, how does one trust with regard to its obligations under WTO or other areas? So this also has ramifications for assessments of risk on a much more comprehensive basis. Then, of course, sometimes it's forgotten, but there are similarities in the two socialist systems between Vietnam and China, and there is a long history of relations, and there are mechanisms, etc., that can come into play to reduce tensions at appropriate junctures in time. The other issue is perhaps more recent assessments by Beijing itself of the counterbalancing that we're seeing within the region. And then there is also the cost from a Chinese perspective of, say, greater third-party involvement, whether that's, say, in a diplomatic level by Australia and perhaps through that enhanced comprehensive partnership, or other developments that we've already had noted with regard to Japan and the United States. So for my final, sorry, this is actually second last slide. In terms of Beijing's contingencies, I do think we can see that under certain circumstances, that it is actually actively pursuing a blue water naval or a projection capacity, the projection of power across the entire sub-region through these land reclamation activities. There may be calculations here. There's often an assumption about, or too much focus, in my opinion, between what China does, how the US reacts, etc. There may be, and this may be a misguided position, but there may be a belief within certain quarters that certain actions, especially if it's done on an incremental basis, can be maintained below a level that would incite a US or Western collective response. So if the US is kept out of the picture, then what position do the navies of, say, Southeast Asia have to resist anything that China has in some form of grand strategy, to use Brendan Taylor's sort of terminology in some of his informative articles on a variety of subjects. in the other side of the coin, however, is we are dealing with authoritarian countries. In some instances, in the case of China, performance, legitimacy, continued economic growth, the continued advancement of people's way of life, lifestyle, etc., is key. This can tie into the issue and calculations about the importance of access to energy and resources. Nationalism, as I've already mentioned, linked to this identity, is a problem. One Peking University scholar said, if you ask a 50-year-old on the streets of Beijing to draw a map of China, he will draw a map of mainland China. If you ask a 20-year-old, he or she will draw a map with a giant sort of tongue hanging down. That is the China and the South China Sea. This is part of every student's education, according to this professor. This may create a kind of trap to which even in the future, under circumstances, there might be circumstances where the Central Party wish to make a compromise, but what is their capacity to do so without a significant domestic backlash? And so therefore we have this kind of stalemate occurring between the parties to this dispute. On top of that, its identity by leaders and beyond as sort of perhaps seeking to reassert its Middle Kingdom status from centuries and millennia past, and also respond to or overcome or whatever its so-called century of shame or paraphrases thereof. So final slide here. I think it's safe to say we will continue to see regional disunity. In fact, I think as someone who primarily specialises in ASEAN, the outlook in the political and security spheres of cooperation for ASEAN is increasingly dire, given the political and strategic nexus between economic relationships and also strategic relationships. And this is not separate from issues of whether you are authoritarian or democratic, either, with some exceptions. We also see, and I think this ties in with Leszek's comments, increased connectedness between Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, Japan, etc., and South Asia, India, for example. And so this connectedness also ties into the greater risk of great power involvement. Indeed, perhaps the South China Sea can be seen as a kind of proxy, perhaps for reasons that it is seen as being lower risk, which may in fact end up being the opposite, but as a proxy for some of the strategic rivalry and easier to play out, again a misassessment, than say in other parts. Societal stresses, desertification, environmental degradation, corruption, etc., will also play into the predictability of China's behaviour, its planning. Even within China, some people conceded the idea or the concern that certain aspects are reactionary, although I think overall we are seeing very coordinated activity between Coast Guard, military, etc. And certainly, I do also re-emphasise earlier comments about South China Sea being a test for future Chinese behaviour as a great power. And so this is something that is of particular importance to Australia, to see how responsible it is and how it reacts. And some of the statements I, and Leszek as well, heard in Beijing were very disconcerting in this regard. And for Australia itself, I do worry that we see not just what's happening in the South China Sea, but issues with Japan, etc. And yet, last financial year, 36.7% of our exports went to China. My colleague Andrew Carr just wrote to me today and also highlighted that 50.1% of Australia's total exports are minerals and fuel, such as hydrocarbons, etc. And I think there's an important debate to be had in maybe reassessing some of the presumptions of the Australian economic model and the sustainability of our current pathway or trajectory, given that what will remain for the future is the fact that the US is our key security ally, and how does this sit, or how will this sit, if we have a situation in the future where perhaps for the world, to have a slightly alarmist tone here, comes closer to some formal level, potentially, of peak global GDP, but certainly if not that, increased resource scarcity and competition over resources and increased pressure over economic development, both in the developed and developing worlds. If we think about global climate change and other issues and bring that all into the picture, we've actually got a very challenging few decades or next century ahead. So hopefully that might provoke some questions for later on. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rory, for the opportunity to co-host this evening's event, and also congratulations on your appointment as head of the NSC. After being friends from afar over many years, it's really just so exciting to have you here and to be working together. And it's also a privilege to be able to share the podium with two such long-standing friends, Chris and Leszek, on their very special evening tonight. I think that Chris and Leszek have really done a wonderful job really highlighting just how assertive Chinese behaviour has become over the past half decade or more in the South China Sea. I think few, if any, in the room would dispute that proposition. I think often less acknowledged, however, is just how much more assertive Australian thinking and approaches to the South China Sea has also become in recent times. It's just over 2 years ago, on a night like this, in fact, and just down the road at the ANU, that the then Foreign Minister, Bob Carr, gave a speech in which he reiterated that it was Australia's position not to take sides in the South China Sea disputes, and where he outlined a number of options in which the claimants might productively move towards managing their differences. Today, when officials refer to the management of the South China Sea disputes, it's much more in terms of deterring China, of opposing and resisting Chinese coercion. And this is matched by a policy and public debate that's also become much more hard-edged in terms of how Canberra should be approaching the South China Sea. Now, part of the reason for this is, of course, that we've had a change of government, a couple of changes of government during that period. And let's be clear, as Leszek and Chris have said, part of this is also a product of the fact that Chinese behaviour has become more assertive during this period. But what worries me, though, is that this really quite significant shift to the approach that Australia is taking is based upon three underlying assumptions, each of which I think is quite questionable and which haven't been subjected to sufficient scrutiny. And the first of those assumptions is that Australia has an active interest in the South China Sea because of our economic dependence. This is an argument that's been made tonight because of the fact, or the supposed fact, that 60% of our trade passes through this body of water. Now, to be fair to everyone who's used this statement tonight, or the statistic, it's one that's used very frequently, and I'm honestly not sure exactly where the figure comes from. But I do know, however, that it's actually very hard to make these sorts of estimates. And by my own estimates, the 60% figure is actually rather suspect. And I make this rather bold assertion for a number of reasons. I think if you look at where Australian shipping to Japan goes, most of that generally goes east of the Philippines and thereby is well clear of either of the China Seas. If you look at our shipping that goes to the north of China and to Korea, that will generally go through the East China Sea rather than the South China Sea. And it's really only our trade to southern China, Hong Kong and Vietnam, that most of that does pass through the South China Sea. And that, of course, includes the very significant LNG traffic from northwest Australia to China. Well, taken together, that certainly sounds to me like a lot less than 60% of Australia's trade. And just as importantly, if you consider China's considerable dependence upon the energy trade in particular, it's hard for me at least to conceive of a situation in which Beijing would see benefit in actively seeking to obstruct the passage of that shipping. A second assumption driving the shift in Australian thinking on the South China Sea relates to the evolving balance of military power in this part of the world. Now, according to this line of reasoning, Chinese actions in the South China Sea are undermining the capacity of the United States to project power across this body of water. Because Australia has long had an interest in maintaining a favourable balance of power in Asia, the assumption here is that we stand the best chance of doing this by banding together with the US allies and partners with a view to checking China's growing power and influence in the South China Sea. Again, I think this is a somewhat questionable assumption. It's certainly true that the People's Liberation Army has made impressive gains over the past 2 decades, and these have almost certainly shifted the balance of military power between China and a number of Southeast Asian countries, namely Vietnam and the Philippines. Yet I also think it's important not to overestimate what these gains have meant in terms of the larger US-China military balance. And I commend to you here a recent article that's been published by my SDSC colleagues Paul Dibb and John Lee. In this article entitled "Why China Will Not Become the Dominant Power in Asia," Paul and John estimate that China is currently approximately 20 years behind the US in high technology weapons. They point out, correctly in my view, that the PLA is a force without any modern combat experience, including experience in the complexities of anti-submarine warfare operations. And even as China does play catch-up, it's important also to point out that the US, despite its own considerable financial pressures of recent years, is a military that's not standing still, as it continues to invest in technological game changers that could actually shift the US-China military balance further in America's favour in the future. Now, against that backdrop, and looking at this from a purely Australian perspective, should we be banding ever closer together with like-minded countries as an additional way of ensuring against any shift to a less favourable regional balance of power? Not necessarily in my own view. It's worth making the point here that China's strategic coercion impacts very differently upon countries across the Asia-Pacific, and that most of these countries have very different motivations and interests at stake than we do. This fact alone makes highly coordinated approaches to Chinese strategic coercion very difficult to achieve. Japan and the Philippines, for instance, see Chinese strategic coercion more through the relatively narrow lens of their respective territorial disputes with Beijing. As Nick Bisley from La Trobe University and I have recently argued in a paper on the East China Sea, when responding to Chinese strategic coercion, it is critical for Australia to be careful not to be drawn prematurely into others' disputes, particularly in relation to issues or episodes where our own interests are not clearly at stake. Last but not least, a third questionable assumption underpinning Australia's shifting approach suggests that Beijing's actions in the South China Sea reflect a carefully calibrated grand strategy to establish a Southeast Asian sphere of influence, and which is a strategy which is ultimately designed to evict the United States from the broader Asia-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific, a term that Rory has been closely associated with. Now, this is a very complex subject, of course, and there are some in the audience, including my very dear friend and colleague, Professor Richard Rigby, who really has taught me everything that I know about China, who are much better placed to comment on this particular subject than I am. And it may well be the case that Xi Jinping does have in his top drawer some grand plan locked away. But even if he does, I would argue that the gap between the conception and the execution of any grand strategy is a substantial one. One need only ask the Obama administration or the US, for instance, which has been doing really serious grand strategy now for many decades, but which is struggling at present, I would argue, to implement what I think is quite a neatly conceived rebalancing of the strategy, or pivot, as some prefer to call it, in the highly diverse and difficult Asia-Pacific region. So I don't think we should assume for a moment that China will find this task any less challenging. Indeed, China's greatest challenges in executing any grand strategy could well come from within. Some of you will have no doubt seen Linda Jakobsen's excellent work on this subject, where she argues that Chinese coercion in the South China Sea is a product of what she calls fractured authority. She's talking there about some of the domestic problems which drive China's South China Sea policies, and which allow a myriad of maritime actors to push their own agendas. Many of you will have also seen a very controversial recent article by the respected China scholar David Shambar, in which he argues that significant political change in China could happen sooner rather than later, and that the endgame of Chinese communist rule in China is already underway. Now, in the final analysis, I think many would argue that these arguments go too far, And in raising them here, my aim is not to suggest that we simply all sit on our hands and wait for the morning where we wake up and find that China has disintegrated. Hope is never a good basis for any strategy, and I'm not sure that any of us, or many of us certainly would hope for such an outcome in any case. Instead, these arguments that are put forward by the likes of Jakobsen and Chambard do remind us of the importance of continuing to develop a much better understanding of the type of China that we are trying to influence, if that is the path that we choose to go down. For a strong China will almost certainly react very differently to the same stimuli than a weak and fragmented one. As we contemplate these questions and the other assumptions underpinning the really quite significant shift that I believe has taken place in Australia's approach to the South China Sea, Leszek and Chris's new book provide a perfect place to start. Thanks very much.
Questions or comments, please, on any aspect of what we've spoken about this evening. I'll take one up there and maybe one other one in reserve. We'll start with you and we'll go to the next, please. And introduce yourself if you don't mind.
My name's Will. I'm from the NSC. I was interested in Chris Roberts' point about the role of Indonesia and how it might act as like a mediator or a claimant in its own right. What do you think the role of middle powers might be in the region in terms of seeking out their own bilateral even arrangements to this crisis, opposed to just looking to China and the US to sort it out?
Thanks. We'll take one more before, just so that you get a chance to have your say, everybody. One more question or comment from the group. You've come here with all the answers already. Okay. Look, I might just add one to that mix as well, and that is, it's really probably a question for Brendan, because I think I appreciated your analysis, I guess, of the Chinese perspective. I didn't hear from you what you think a reasonable or alternative set of strategies from China might be. What do you think is the best possible approach the region can hope for from China? I'd like you to think about that one while Chris answers the first question. Here you go.
Thank you. I think countries such as Indonesia have played a critical role. If we look at, for example, the days and weeks that followed the joint communique in 2012, and then Foreign Minister Marty Natalegawa, I'm told, personally drafted the 6-point plan in response and undertook something like, in 72 hours, trips to Cambodia, Vietnam and the Philippines to get at least a sort of a compromised position and to alleviate the tensions. And so that's an example of a country that is definitely a middle power, a rising, emerging regional power that has had a long history of a role. It, of course, represents 1/3 of ASEAN in terms of both populace and economy, so it also has that privileged position as a founding member and the first among equals, as the Southeast Asians would say. But nonetheless, combined efforts of other middle powers, including Australia, perhaps this enhanced comprehensive partnership with Vietnam also sends important signals, together with many other activities and statements that Australia can make and be active in, including exercises, etc., in the South China Sea that will affect the overall cost-benefits analysis by China. So I think any approach has to be plural. It has to be, multi-level, multi-dimensional, legal, diplomatic, maybe a few sticks and carrots, comprehensive, through multilateral institutions, through as many countries as possible, all sending as much as is feasible a common united signal that sort of exceptionalist behaviour, breaches of UNCLOS, etc., is not something that's going to be tolerated and will have real and tangible costs for Beijing. Thank you.
Thanks. And Brendan, my question about China's perspective, and maybe going also to the point about, is the current Chinese pattern of behaviour something that the region should accept? And what are some alternative Chinese patterns of behaviour that we could reasonably expect?
Yes, no, absolutely, Rory, and thanks for that question. And thanks also for not throwing me out of the room, because I know there's probably a lot that I said that you wouldn't agree with, but we've agreed in friendly terms over many years, which is... Yes. But I think, your question is a very good one, and the way I'd react to that would be by... the first thing I'd say is that I see China as very, very much a reactive power, or there are elements of reaction in its approach to things. And I think it's the sort of power that the harder it gets pushed, the harder it pushes back. It's not the only power to do that, but by virtue of its sheer size, I think when it does push back, the ramifications of that are often more significant. And I think what we see, and I think Chris highlighted this very well in his remarks about land reclamation, that we see a situation at the moment where, China is guilty of a lot of the things it's doing in the region, but it's not the only guilty party in the region. I think that we do see elements of action-reaction going on and elements of an emerging security dilemma. So, it's easy for me to say sitting behind an academic desk, but what I would prefer to see would be a little bit of easing off and just for us to see what happens for a while. And I do think that we do have time on our side. I think that yes, I think that some of the discussions at the moment, certainly about these military outposts that China has established in the South China Sea. I concede that over time they could become very significant strategically and militarily, but I think at the moment that's not the case. I think we do have some time to see how the situation evolves. I think as Leszek's presentation highlighted beautifully, this is a strategic question. It's one that I think is going to play out not over the longer term, but certainly over a medium term. And if we do ease off and see that there is no change in Chinese behaviour, then I'll concede that you're right, and the next, that's a good question. Is that what is the time frame? And I don't have a good answer for that, but certainly trying to get away from this action-reaction dynamic that I think is actually intensifying at the moment, and that some countries in the region are actually looking to see that intensify.
I think we're going to have another conversation about this. We'll reconvene hopefully in the not too distant future. Leszek, a question for you, unless there's another question from the audience perhaps. We'll take one from the back and then we'll take yours, George. We'll take both. I haven't seen your hand up, Richard, but I know it's there. We'll take three. One. Please introduce yourself, please.
I'm sorry. My name is Leszek from NSC. I'm also a student here. And first of all, thank you very much for the very interesting public lecture. My question being, how Japan influenced the current South China Sea situation, given that Japan holds strong interest in the dispute? And do you think that any approach Japan takes will influence Austria's position over the dispute, given the increasing strategic tie between the two countries?
Thanks, we'll take that. And then Richard Rigby and then George Brennan. Richard.
Okay, yeah, Richard Rigby, Australia. There are two observations that are sometimes made, and I'd just like to see what anybody in the panel, how they react to this. And they're not necessarily my observations, so I'm trying very hard not to look like I'm being a panda hugger as well. But these are observations that are not mine, but I'm aware of them through my reading. One is that China actually controls considerably less of what it claims as compared to any of the other claimants. China's got big claims, but actually it's not actually controlling very, very much at all. And this is one reason for heightened activism, and that activism is further heightened by the existence of UNCLOS itself, where there's a necessity to prove that you are actually in effective control and so on and so forth. And perhaps they read back from the lack of activity over vis-a-vis the Diallo Senkakus as well, and think, well, we better not be making that mistake. We've got to show that we're doing so, we're being serious about it. So that's two things that are said. I'm just doing something. The other, does anybody in the book say anything about Taiwan? Because Taiwan is obviously relative. The PRC claims are based on Taiwan's claims, which are actually marginally bigger. When I was recently in Taipei, we were sent personally by the president to go and sort of look at the exhibition that had been put on, presenting those claims. They're 12-line or 9-line, because they see Chinese communists as having given a bit too much to the Vietnamese. Taiwan still actually does hold a considerable bit of territory there, and it continues to replenish it militarily. How does that fit in?
Thanks. So one question on Japan, a series of comments and questions from Richard, and George will take yours as well, and then I think we might have room for one more. I want to give the panellists a smorgasbord of questions that they can pick and choose from. So, George.
Mine builds a little on Richard's, which is the Chinese would like this take on it, the complexity of Chinese internal dynamics. We've been talking about China as a monolithic thing, which we all understand it isn't. And of course the Chinese would be happy to see Taiwan fill up with that in that context. There's China is far more of a land power than a maritime power, and its internal dynamics are complex. It has a nasty set of things all around its borders. So I'm interested in how people think that might play out, and as a related part of that, and you can chime in on this one, Rory, how India's interest in the Chinese-Indian relationship might throw into the mix as this plays out.
You've muddied the waters for us beautifully there, George.
They seem far too crystal clear to me.
And Ashley Townsend from Lowy Institute, I saw you had your hand up earlier and put it down again, but I'm going to put you on the spot. I think you had a comment or question as well.
Thanks, Rory, and not actually formally part of the Lowy Institute anymore, but Rory and I are working on a project on Chinese strategy in the region and maritime security. I just came back from a research trip where a couple of these issues came up. There's a very strong sense, as you all know, that China's restraint for 20 years has been abused by the other claimants in the region, and I got this from everyone I spoke to in China. That's not surprising, but there is a dilemma that goes with that the Chinese themselves seem to be facing and don't quite know the best way to get out of. The dilemma is this: they feel that their restraint has been abused, and therefore there's a need to build something to catch up. As Brendan articulated, they're far behind, but they're trying to respond to what others have been doing. The region is then pushing back and saying, well, this is illegitimate, even though it's what we've done before, and there's no space for a discussion on that issue. That's the first point. Is there a way for there to be some discussion on the legitimacy of what everyone in the region has done over 20 years, for it all to be open and negotiated? And secondly, following on from that, if that discussion is not possible and the only answer that comes from Washington and the region is arbitration, there's another problem, because China doesn't recognise the legitimacy of the arbitration process in its entirety. And that's not just because it doesn't view arbitration as being an accurate venue, a good venue for discussing sovereignty issues. It actually has problems with the legitimacy of the laws and the courts and the individuals involved. So is there room, in the opinion of the panel, to open up the debate about arbitration more broadly to actually accommodate or at least discuss Chinese concerns and find ways to address them? Because there does seem to be some willingness for China to find a legal mechanism by which it can start to talk about these issues.
Thanks, Ashley. We've got a whole set of thoughts there for the panel to respond to. I'm going to ask Leszek first, and Leszek, you can pick and choose from among those, but I would especially want to hear what you have to say on Japan. Leszek, yeah, cheers.
Yeah. I think the direction of the question was, what's the link between Japan and Australia with reference to the South China Sea, and would Japan's moves in the South China Sea actually strengthen or push Japan to develop corresponding tighter relations, security relations with Australia? I think that was the gist of the question. It seems to me, yes, Japan is becoming much more involved under the Abe Shinzo government, and the Japanese are very concerned. They look at the map and they see China's moves in the south, and they see how China's moves may result, if China ends up by dominating the area, despite their assurances that freedom of navigation will be maintained. The Japanese certainly will not trust the Chinese with respect to that, and they see that it will result in a very costly rerouting of trade and shipments of oil around that area. And that worries them very deeply. So their moves are related to Vietnam and the Philippines, not Australia. Now, where Australia comes in is over the Sengaku Taoyo issue. The Japanese have attempted to draw Australian support over that issue, and as Brendan has mentioned, that Australia has been very reluctant to get involved over that issue. The second point about Richard Rigby's comment about China's claim is less than that of others. I just want to point out that...
No, I said that China is actually in control of much less of its claims than those of others.
Okay, China controls the Paracel Islands.
China's claim is huge, we all know that.
Yeah, okay. China controls the Paracel Islands. It also controls 7 features, some say 9 features, which it obtained after the 1988 clash with Vietnam. Now it sits on Scarborough Shoal, so you add another one. And Vietnam has occupied more features than China, true, but China occupies more features than Malaysia or the Philippines. So I don't think that China occupies less than the others, less than Vietnam, I agree, but not less than the other claimants. As regards Taiwan, yes, there was mention in the book about Taiwan's 11-dash line, that the original 9-dash line in 1947, the original claim was had 11 dashes, and then 2 dashes were removed to conciliate Vietnam, and Taiwan continued with the 11-dash line. And you mentioned Taiwanese occupation of Itu Aba, that key island. It has a marine detachment there, and there has been some speculation as to whether or not Taiwan would act with Beijing in this area, since they have related claims. But as I understand the Taiwanese position, there was a Taiwanese official who said that Taiwan would not cooperate with Beijing over the South China Sea. We have someone from a representative of Taiwan here who may like to confirm or add to that. India's interests, no, that is a question for Rory. The last one about arbitration, China's restraint and arbitration, legal mechanism. I personally think that China, I agree that arbitration is alien. Legal arbitration is very alien to the Chinese at this moment. Chinese society has not evolved as a legal society, and legal mechanisms are distrusted. And so I don't think that China would respond very kindly to whatever the arbitral tribunal would decide. So my own inclination is that China will, at least in the short term, ignore the decision and perhaps lay the ground for some future acceptance. But the immediate reaction would be to ignore the arbitral tribunal, and I can't see, on that basis, I can't see how any legal mechanism could be established to work with the Chinese. They insist that history should be taken into account. I've spoken to some Chinese scholars about this, about their conception of law, that law should change, international law should accommodate, and UNCLOS should accommodate Chinese historical claims. And law should not stay still, it should change. In which case, if it changes with every rising power's demands, if you change it now, does it mean that next 10 years down the track you change it again according to new demands raised by China? The law has to be more stable than that. And they're demanding changes to international law to accommodate the rise, and yet many of the aspects of law that they want to see changed, they accepted previously. UNCLOS they signed on the line, and they ratified UNCLOS in 2006 and 1995. And now, as they become more powerful, they seek changes because they feel that they should receive due respect from, and that should be accorded by international law. So their understanding of law is considerably different from ours, and because it's meant to reflect power relations, and that would result in considerable instability. So I can't see how a legal mechanism could be devised to propitiate the Chinese in the way the questioner outlined until China understands the significance of law. I want to add something else about just a little reference here to about very briefly about speaking to Chinese scholars in Beijing, which we have done. I've done that for many years, because the Chinese scholars in the various institutes live in a very rigidly compartmentalized system and know little about the military, the PLA, or what the party is doing and what the party thinks. And I think that's one of the problems in reaching out to the Chinese. We may reach out to the scholars, we may reach out to the legal experts, those who are well versed in international law, but those who make the decisions are very often somewhere else.
Thank you. Chris, you were very generous with your comments earlier, so please be parsimonious now, because we're at to wrap up.
I agree about being a willing signatory to UNCLOS, albeit with exceptions or exemptions made on certain aspects of arbitration. But nonetheless, there are aspects that are clear, such as a clause within UNCLOS that states that no party to a dispute will amend or change or threaten the status quo, exacerbate tensions, etc. In other words, they must peacefully negotiate a change. It is that said, it is true that Vietnam, for example, occupies more features, but also, I guess, there's the question of quantity versus quality as well, and so the quality issue being forthcoming, if not already, airstrips, etc., and resupply, surveillance capabilities, etc., beyond any other country out there. In regard to its willingness or desire to reach a solution, we've seen a lot of, to put it bluntly, some duplicitous behaviour within ASEAN, where there are statements sometimes where we don't want multilateral approaches. There are statements where, yes, we will negotiate a code of conduct. And then when the statements are made, for example, instead of a senior officials meeting taking place to work on certain aspects, it's pushed down to a lower level, knowing that the people at that level within an ASEAN context won't have the authority to actually reach a conclusion that leads to anything, so it becomes just a stalling tactic, whereby maybe linking to an earlier comment today, when it does finally agree, if ever, to some solution, the new status quo is well and truly within its favour and what it's completely, entirely comfortable with. And in regard to perspectives in China and the willingness to compromise, it's quite alarming when the head, for example, of a government-funded think tank sits there and states, we're not even interested in the central part of the South China Sea. I've had military generals in one of the other claimant states saying that's open. We're willing to have a negotiation here. But this particular head said that we're interested directly in the EEZs of the claimant states because that's where the accessible oil is. When I then asked... That's transparency. That's transparency, yes. When I then asked, but that is completely contrary to any interpretation of international law, and why would anyone share? He said, well, we're offering 50-50% share. Right down to, he didn't say the beach, but this is what it meant. And then I said, but no one would agree to give something that is absolutely not your... And then the statement came up, well, 10, 20 years from now, that 50-50 will be off the cards and we will have the capacity to just take it like that. So when you have statements, and other statements that if they were to be public in the press would create protests in Vietnam tomorrow. When you have controversial statements, recklessly given by people in very senior positions with responsibilities, that's somewhat disconcerting. So I might just leave it at that. Thank you.
I'm hoping that that was one of the people who Leszek referred to earlier who actually may not know what's going on, but I have no judgment on that. I respect our peers everywhere. I'm going to leave the last comment from the panel to you, Brendan, and I'll give you a golden minute. So.
Okay. No worries, Rory. And can I congratulate you on herding 3 unruly academics so well? But just very, very quickly, a minute in response to Len's question and Ashley's question. Welcome back, Ashley. It's great to see you again. Len, I think with respect to anyone in the room from Japan, including your good self, I think Japan is part of the problem here. I think that for very understandable reasons, Japan is an extremely insecure position at the moment as the balance of military power between itself and China shifts. But once again, I don't think we should overestimate how quickly that is shifting, but I think it is very clearly shifting in Chinese favour over time. But I think Japan's growing involvement in the South China Sea, I think is really fueling, or one of the factors fueling this intensification of the security dilemma that I talked about, particularly its assistance to Vietnam and the Philippines. I think a little further away in the East China Sea, I think also Japan's refusal to take its own dispute with China over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands to arbitration, I think is letting China off the hook in the South China Sea. So I think if Japan were to give a bit of ground there, which I think is unlikely, I think we could potentially see some movement. I think your point on Australia is a very good one. I think we are seeing the potential for Japanese behaviour in the South China Sea to influence Australian behaviour, to see a degree of imitation on Australia's side. There have been some very respected analysts in this town talking about the possibility of Australia making its defence engagement more meaningful by providing more assistance, particularly in the form of patrol vessels to Vietnam and the Philippines, for instance. I'm not sure, and Chris would be more of an authority of this than I would, but I'm not sure that's something that would be wholly welcomed across Southeast Asia, and it may in fact complicate our efforts to engage with that particular sub-region. In the interest of time, Ashley, I'll connect with you afterwards, because Rory, I think the audience would love to hear your views on India and the South China Sea in a minute as well.
No, I'll give you 30 seconds, and I know we're eating into valuable drinks and conversation time. Look, on India, but on external stakeholders generally, if I can call them that, I mean, we can argue about the numbers later about whose trade goes through the waters and how much of it and so forth, but I think there's no question that the South China Sea is globally significant as a key energy and trade lifeline for a whole lot of countries. In that sense, it's not only about India or Japan or countries that are not, Southeast Asian countries or claimant countries. In my mind, the South China Sea is a global challenge. It is a global problem. The fact that we now live in an interconnected Indo-Pacific region, and the South China Sea in a way is at the very heart of the Indo-Pacific, means that this problem is going to remain everyone's problem, including our European friends for that matter, who of course have very large stakes in the trade going through those waters. So I'm going to end on that very ambiguous note, I guess. I'm also going to say that the college will continue to convene both discussions and publications on this and related issues. We certainly are not home to one point of view, as you've heard tonight. We're very pleased to host a diversity of views, but I think what's important is we put this debate a little bit more squarely on the table. In Australia, it's not an issue that can be brushed aside. It's not an issue that can be overlooked, given all of our other security concerns. So thank you to my colleagues on the panel. Congratulations again to the authors of the book, and one last time for the record, for the camera, here is the book. There is also an occasional paper published by this college. I invite you all to join us for drinks and conversation. I also want to thank my colleagues, particularly Martin Leszek, our communications and events organiser, for putting this event together, and Andrew Carr from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. We look forward to seeing you again here at the National Security College very soon. Congratulations and thank you. Well done. Yes, yeah. Thank you. Cheers, Leszek.